Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you, both in the room and those who are joining us online, as I know many of you are. Welcome to this Resolution event. I'm Gavin Kelly, Chair of the Resolution Foundation. Welcome to this event, Precarious Profits, where we are going to try and get underneath some of the headlines of a really important, sometimes contentious issue, which is kind of the use of very flexible and sometimes precarious contracts by firms. And we're going to look at today the motivations of firms, the different motivations of firms for using those sorts of working arrangements, the frequency of use, how it varies across different sectors, different size of firms and so on. And then we're going to get a bit into some of the policy discussion which is taking place about what to do about it. So there is a very topical conversation, I think. It's topical, I think it's important, first of all, because this is an issue, lots of issues have this, but this issue in particular, I think, is prone to generalisation, sometimes oversimplification, and it's quite nuanced in many ways. So we're going to try and get at some of that nuance if we can this morning, which doesn't mean to say everyone's going to agree about it, but we're going to try and kind of out some of those complexities. And we really want to try and give a better understanding as to what is happening in the labour market in terms of these types of working arrangements, why it's happening, how prevalent it is in different sectors, so we really can kind of root any policy discussion in a kind of rich understanding of the facts rather than shoutiness, which occasionally happens in British public policy. And this really does matter because, as some of you may notice, we are heading into an election season. In fact, we are in an election season, I would say. And we know that the opposition party, the Labour Party, has got a new deal for workers, which speaks to, which has a set of policies which are relevant to today's discussion. That means there's going to be lots of claim and counterclaim in an election contest. So the more fact-based that discussion, the better. So this morning is our contribution to that. To help us through that, we have a great panel. You're going to hear first from my colleague Hannah Slaughter, who's a senior economist at the Resolution Foundation, who leads lots of our stuff on the labour market and has authored today's report. So thank you, Hannah. Then we're going to hear on my right from Kate Nichols, who's the Chief Executive of UK Hospitality since, I think, 2018. And you will have heard Kate on your radio or read her in your newspapers, I'm sure. If you haven't, I don't know what's going on, because I often do. And then we're going to hear from Chris Smallwood on my left, who is the Director of Anchor Removals, which is a removals business in the Northwest, in Salford. He's also a living wage employer.
I am indeed, yeah.
So that will be a fascinating conversation about the challenges in your sector and the approach you take. I should also say that today's conversation is really centred on firms, different types of firms, and why they do what they do and how they think about it. Of course, there's another side to this equation, which is workers, and obviously we'll be touching on workers today, clearly. You can't talk about this issue without that. But we will have another event and another Hannah-produced report, which looks at how workers feel about different types of highly flexible working arrangement, what the consequences can be, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and so on. But we are doing that, producing that on another day. Someone is very noisy, and I don't think it's me, so we'll try and sort that out. But we'll come back to the impact on workers on another day sometime soon, so please do watch out for that. We'll make sure that we have time to hear from you. If you've got questions, please do put them on slido.com, the usual place, and we will throw up a poll at some point too to get your take on that. But with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to Hannah. Thank you.
Cool, thank you, Gavin. I'll first start by thanking Unbound Philanthropy, who have funded this report today. And as Gavin said, this is a report on firms, and this is actually launching a new programme of work we're doing here at the Foundation on precarity in the labour market, which will come back to workers and also policy recommendations later in that programme. And I'd also like to thank my colleague Lindsay Judge, who has helped a lot with this report and putting it together. So today we're going to be talking about flexible contracts, and by that we mean any kind of contract that might bring with it some kind of uncertainty over income, hours, whether it's a variable hours contract, whether it's a short-term temporary contract. We're not thinking about self-employment today, but we will do later on in this programme. But the contracts that we're thinking about today are really quite prevalent in our labour market. So this chart is just showing, first of all, that about 1 in 8 employees are employed on one of these contracts. That's just under 4 million workers. Which kinds of contracts are we talking about? So this, the purple bar is split out by the different kinds of things that we're considering. So about 1 in 10 employees are employed on a variable hours contract and are paid by the hour, so that affects their pay. We've got about 3.5% of workers on a 0 hours contract, and then smaller shares of workers on casual, seasonal and short-term temporary contracts of less than 6 months. And so these are contracts that might bring with them precarity if depending on the circumstances, and we'll come back to how concerned we should be in a moment. But first, just to kind of look at how they vary across the labour market. There's obviously a sectoral skew. So some of the sectors where these contracts are most common are hospitality up in the right-hand corner. We've also got wholesale and retail, other services and transport and storage, and I'm sure in the discussion we'll come back to the different challenges that each sector faces. But equally, these contracts are broad-based. It's they do feature in sectors across the labour market, so it's not a case of just it's 1 or 2 sectors that where these contracts are particularly prevalent. So how concerned should we be about these contracts? The name flexible contracts implies flexibility, and if that's flexibility that workers benefit from, that's good news. But there are some reasons why we might be concerned about these contracts for some workers, and this is just one example of why. So this chart is showing you, this is based on employers whose hours do vary from week to week, and it shows who actually chooses the hours that those people work. So the top bar is looking at all workers, and that green bar shows that about half of workers whose hours vary get to choose their own hours. Then the blue bar is showing that about a third say their employer chooses, but they do have a minimum guaranteed hours. And then that red bar to the right-hand side is showing that their employer chooses and they don't get any guaranteed hours, so basically 0 hours kind of contract. But then if you look at the bottom bar here, which is workers who are paid by the hour, so again where that impacts their pay, only about 3 in 10 get to choose their own hours, and about 1.9 million employees on the whole don't have variable hours. That affects their pay, and they don't get to choose their hours. Obviously this is quite a blunt measure, and I'm sure there's nuance to how much say people do get in practice, but this is one example where this might be concerning. And there are other reasons too that flexible contracts might impact living standards, both take-home pay and things like ability to access credit or get a mortgage. There's evidence that if these contracts do become precarious, that can impact health. And so there are definitely reasons why we might be concerned about these contracts in some cases. But having thought a bit about the worker side, and as Gavin said, we'll come back to the worker side in future outputs, this report really focuses on firms' views and actually getting employers' take on these contracts. So to do that, we ran a survey asking employers about their use of these kinds of contracts and why they do it, and what are their plans for the future. So the first kind of finding from that is that when we surveyed employers, we found that about 3/4 said that they had used some form of the flexible contracts that I outlined before at some point in 2023. So that tots up to about 1.7 million firms. We also found that larger employers were more likely to report using these contracts than smaller ones, and of course there was a sectoral skew there as well. But actually, when employers are using these contracts, it's often for quite a small share of their workforce. So this chart is just kind of bringing out the different kinds of contract that we asked about, and showing among employers what percentage of our respondents said they were using these contracts for different shares of their workforce. So perhaps to take the top bar first, which is the fixed term contracts for less than 6 months. Firstly, about a quarter of employers that we surveyed weren't using any at all. But then a good chunk of them, those kind of lighter blue bars there, were actually using them for a very small share of their workforce over the course of the year. So less than 10%, and kind of the typical employer was using those kinds of contracts for about between 5 and 10%. So kind of a relatively small share of their workforce. There are some employers where they're using them for larger proportions, those kind of red bars towards the right-hand side, but that tends to be a minority of employers. That said, we did find that around half of employers were using one or more of these forms of contracts for at least half of their workforce, so were in the kind of purple, pink and red bars for in at least one of these contract types. So, and that's a group that we'll come back to, and they're kind of employers where this is kind of a more fundamental part of their business model. We call them the kind of high use group of firms. So why do employers use these contracts? So for lots of employers, these are a route to actually supporting their workforce, or kind of using them for very understandable and kind of day-to-day reasons. Of course, for some employers, it's because workers actually want these contracts. So about a third of employers are saying on the left-hand side there that one of the reasons they use these contracts is because their staff prefer them. Equally, we've got about 1 in 5 who are saying they're using them as kind of a stopgap approach to manage absences and staff holidays, or to hire staff with specialist skills, and that's kind of slightly higher shares of our high use firms. They're saying that, so the ones that use a lot of these contracts. So it's definitely, there's definitely very good reasons why firms are using these contracts. When we look at the different kind of broad categories of driver that we asked about, the most common was actually the nature of firms' demand. So we go into this in more detail in the report. This can be kind of uncertainty over demand, the fact that your demand is seasonal, and that's about half of employers said that was a reason for using these kinds of contracts. So the overall kind of bar here in that top bar, and about a quarter, so the dark purple bar on the left-hand side, said that was the most important reason for them using these contracts. But equally, and perhaps more concerningly, is that the second most commonly cited reason among employers was that they're using these contracts to reduce their costs. And 1 in 4 employers, so that's the left bar here, said that they're using these contracts to lower their overall wage bill. And then slightly smaller shares of employers saying things like lowering their recruitment costs, lowering their responsibility for things like national insurance, auto-enrolment, or training and development. And we also had about 1 in 7 saying that they're using these contracts to offset rises in the minimum wage. It's worth saying that our survey was fielded just after the minimum wage rise came in, so perhaps a bit more front of mind for employers, but it's quite a striking finding. And again, many of these reasons were more commonly cited among high-use firms. A smaller gap for lowering the overall wage bill, but more of a kind of difference for some of the other costs that employers face. So, I mean, I won't go into all the other different reasons we asked firms about, but if you read the report, we kind of get into some of the other nuances. But I'll move on in the interest of time into what should we expect in the future. So this chart is showing you what firms say they're expecting to happen to their use of flexible contracts over the next 5 years. So this is just among firms who are actually using them, and you can see that it's quite similar among the different contract types. But again, to take the top bar for simplicity, this is variable hours contracts where that affects the workers' pay. About half of employers say that they expect their use of these contracts to increase as a share of their workforce over the next 5 years. And crucially, that's much larger than the share saying that they expect the share of their workforce on these contracts to decrease, which is the blue bars. So based on this, we might think, okay, there's, at least among businesses currently using these contracts, we can expect a rise in these contracts to come. I mean, there's nuance behind it, what firms expect to happen versus what circumstances dictate. But one thing I wanted to draw out was that the kind of final question in our survey asked firms what would actually get them to change their minds, what would get them to use less of these contracts in the future. So one important factor is policy. So we kind of put in front of respondents a few different policy proposals that have kind of been proposed by ourselves or others, and we've so for things these are the darker purple bars here. So for things like workers having a right to a fixed number of hours, workers having a right to 2 weeks notice of their shift patterns, or workers having to be classed as employees rather than workers or dependent contractors, and about just under 2/3 of firms said that any one or more of these dark purple bars would get, those policies might get them to reduce their use of flexible contracts. And likewise, it's worth kind of ending on this point, coming back to the point about employers using these sometimes to support their workforce, and actually just under 1/5 of employers said that if their workforce didn't want to be employed on these contracts, that would change their behaviour as well. And I guess the final thing to take from this chart is that very few firms said that none of these, either policy changes, their workers' preferences, or kind of wider issues around the economy would get them to change their behaviour. So firms are very much kind of adapting to the circumstances that they face. So just to conclude, before we move on to the discussion, as Gavin said at the beginning, these flexible contracts can, that there are lots of strong views from businesses, worker groups, policymakers about these contracts, ranging from people thinking they're universally good to universally bad. But I think what this report kind of highlights, among other things, is that the reality is far more nuanced. So some firms are using them to cut costs, and there will be some who are kind of really using these contracts as an exploitative practice, but equally there are lots of employers who are using them because their workers want them, or because their demand is seasonal, and there's a really broad range of reasons there why employers want to use these contracts. And one kind of conclusion, and again this is kind of a more descriptive paper, we'll come back to policy later in the programme, but it's kind of clear that for some workers these can be beneficial. We know that from other research out talking to workers as well. And so the policy focus here should really be on giving workers the option to more stable contracts so that they can have different arrangements if they want them, but not unduly restricting these kinds of contracts when they are in the interest of both the employer and the worker. And that's it from me.
Great, thank you, Hannah. A lot of work, very well summarised, and bang on time too, so impressive. I'm going to hand straight over to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start by agreeing wholeheartedly with Hannah's conclusions. I think, this debate is often polarised. It's often seen as inherently good or inherently bad. The situation, as Hannah has said, is far more nuanced. The only bit I'm going to take sort of slight objection to is that we can separate it out from what workers want and what firms want, because inherently the two are implicitly interlinked, and particularly in our sector in hospitality, it is primarily driven by what our workforce wants. Our workforce are the engine of our businesses. Without them we can't perform. We need to look after the 3.5 million people who work in hospitality, the 1.5 million who work in our supply chain. We are the fourth largest employer in the country, and a vending machine can deliver you a product, only people can deliver you great service. So we rely on our people. We need to make sure that they are looked after and that we have the workforce that we need to fulfil that, but also that their needs are met. And it is principally the latter point that drives what we want to do in hospitality. And I think the other point I would make is that hospitality is really unique in the economy in being able to provide jobs for everyone at any skill level, for any point of entry that they would like to have, either for short term to meet their needs as a step back into the workforce or as their first job in so many cases, but also providing great careers for people from bar to boardroom with no barriers to entry. But we also have an ability to be able to meet the needs of people who want to work on a temporary, a short term or a flexible basis. And I think Hannah's conclusion was absolutely right. What we need to do is to make sure that we strike the right balance about allowing that flexibility that workers want without throwing the baby out with the bathwater or unduly restricting that choice. Our fundamental view is that any worker, whether in hospitality or elsewhere, should have the right to a contract that reflects the regular hours if they want one. And many of our workers and a large proportion of our workforce don't want to have that guaranteed minimum hours, choose not to. We have the option for them to be able to do so, and many of them want to be able to segue back into work, having flexible hours that meet their needs. Employers who are exploiting their workers or do have exploitative contracts do need to be tackled, and we've done a great deal of work over the last 6 years that I've been running UK hospitality, but before that, when we were two separate trade associations, in being able to make sure that we've got really good employability charters and employee well-being initiatives to be able to make sure that people have predictable contracts and that we end the exploitative practices that can go alongside these flexible workers. So we do want to make sure that that's tackled, but in practice, in our sector, despite the fact that we are a high user of these type of flexible contracts, there are very few such exploitative contracts and exploitative companies out there. Any employee that wants to work regular scheduled hours have the right to be able to ask it, and within a contract they can have it set out if they wish to, but equally we need to be able to keep that flexibility if they want. There's 3 key points I wanted to make about the sort of nature of the title that we've got about precarious profits. The first is that, you know, if you look at it, variable hours, flexible hours, and a temporary contract in its sense, but particularly that variable hours and flexible hours, doesn't necessarily equate to 0 hours. And for some cases, that can be something that people would like to be able to do. The variability is what people value about the contracts that we've got. When we talk to our workers, it's not necessarily that they want 0 hours or fixed hours, they want variable hours. If you think about the nature of the employment that we offer, the pathways into employment for students, for carers, the fastest growing workforce we've got is females over 50 who often have caring responsibilities at both sides of the generational gap. What they want is the ability to say that this set of time, we want to work 20 hours, 30 hours, 40 hours. The next 6 months, we want to work 0 hours, or we want to work 20 hours a week when we come back. Students in term time often want to work between 10 and 20 hours a week, and then in the holidays want to lift up to 40, and at exam time want to go back to 0. So it's the variability of those hours that allow us to be able to provide those pathways into employment for people. But also those that are more vulnerable in our society, sick, disabled, long-term homeless, veterans. Again, the unpredictability of their personal circumstances mean they want variable hours. So I don't think we should categorise variable hours as being inherently 0 hours and 0 hours being inherently wrong. I think the other point is that variable hours, flexible hours are not necessarily inherently precarious. When I started working in the sector about 20 to 30 years ago, we had a large proportion, more than a third of our workforce were on temporary short-term contracts. Casual working was how it was described there. I think the biggest transformation we've seen over the last 20 years is that the hospitality sector, yes, still has 60% of its workforce working part-time, but they are on permanent contracts working part-time. That means they have employment rights and they have protections, and we saw during COVID that the benefits that brought to them, as opposed to those genuinely on temporary or agency contracts, which are inherently precarious. So the idea that a variable hours contract, a 0 hours contract is inherently precarious, not the case. Again, if we look at some of the big contract caterers who do public sector catering, they will gear up and have lots of people working for them. Summer times, Christmas times when you've got big events, and in between times they might be having 0 hours and not working at all. They still have their employment rights even if they're on 0 hours contracts. And then the final point, which again is not really what we're talking about today, but you can't escape it in our sector. Variability is demand-led as well as supply-driven. This is not necessarily imposed by employers. In fact, when we do our employer surveys, many of them would say that they would like to be having more certainty around the hours that an individual can work. They would like to be asking for more hours from that employee, but the employee is giving them the hours that they want. And usually in our sector, it is how many hours would you like to work over the next 2 to 4 weeks, and we've moved to make sure we've got certainty for rotas and shift patterns and new technology to allow workers to shift their shifts between each other and shift their rotas between each other if it doesn't suit. So there is maximum flexibility and often it is about us being unable to get more hours that we would like to be able to do, and then hence the use of flexibility in the employment contract. So out of our workforce, we, as I say, have about 2/3 of our workforce that are part-time. Only 16% are on 0 hours contracts, and only 13% are looking to move, of that 16%, are looking to move out of it. Now, I know 16% sounds high, but when you think about how the nature of our business works, that's a large proportion of people who would be wanting to come in for summer jobs, temporary jobs, or working. Of those 13% that are looking for a new role, only a small proportion are looking to move out of hospitality or out of 0 hours. They're looking to move into different routes through. And 63% of our workers on 0 hours contracts are happy with the amount of time that they are working and happy with the fact that they are on 0 hours. It suits them. And so I think the challenge, as Hannah rightly concluded, and I'll wrap up there, is that these are practical employee protections that we have through our permanent, flexible, variable hours contracts. We hope others agree that that should be able to be accommodated in the forthcoming legislation, in addition to the primary purpose of banning exploitation and making sure that those workers who work regular scheduled hours and want to have more predictability can move to that predictable employment pattern and contract of employment where it suits them, where it suits their employer, and where we can continue to grow the workforce within hospitality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Loads in there to unpack, but I'm going to resist the temptation to ask questions straight away. I'm going to hand over to Chris. Different sector, but kind of some same challenges, and you approach them in a really interesting way. So
yeah, so I'm going to have to cross off most of my...
Sorry.
Now, Kate, you stole all my thunder. No, actually, there are a lot of similarities between the hospitality sector and our sector in that it's a low entry level industry and there is a route from bottom to top. And I think that's the first thing to say. So as an industry, there are possibilities for people. It's also, you don't have to be academically well trained to be in our industry. It is actually an industry that's designed for those who potentially feel like they haven't achieved at school but can achieve in a job. And I think there's also often a big misunderstanding that people coming into our industry need to have some sort of intellect. I mean, basic numeracy and literacy are required, but other than that, those are the only qualifications. In terms of contracts, in our industry, we're actually very inflexible as an industry, largely because we are controlled by outside forces. So I run a removals company that carries out furniture removals, and if any of you have moved house, you'll know that that's a fairly complicated process that has two key fundamental parts to it. One is the exchange of contracts, which is when the house deal becomes legal, except in Scotland, and the other is completion, which is where the keys become yours for your new property, your old property becomes somebody else's, and the monies have cleared in the bank account. We're at the mercy of that system, and that system is fundamentally flawed. And the problem with that system is you can't predict when completion is going to be, and there's no guaranteed time span between exchange and completion. So the idea of giving 4 weeks notice for shifts, for example, is an absolute impossibility for our industry because we're not in control of that process. Even to the hours that our staff work on an average day is impossible. So our staff will turn in at 7:30, they'll load up a household of effects to be moved, they'll get to the property, there's a delay in the funds reaching the bank account, they can't deliver, they're now delivering at 6, 7 o'clock at night. So in answer to your question, Gavin, we have done things differently in our business, and I'm really proud of what we've achieved at Anchor Removals. So we became a living wage, living hours employer. Technically, we don't achieve all the criteria of living hours, but we do deal with the failings by ensuring compensations given to our staff if we have late cancellation shifts. However, our staff are unsalaried, so they know what they're going to get paid every week without fail. We're an employer of the year for both Salford and Greater Manchester because what we do is we use the powers that we have with our customers to control the hours that our workers work. But our industry doesn't share our view on that. So, for example, in the unlikely event that keys are delayed to a point where we're going to be asked to start unloading a 4-hour unload at 4 o'clock at night, that isn't going to happen. We're going to instruct the client that we will deliver what we can to make them comfortable for the evening. Our staff will finish normal hours and then we'll start again the next day. It does have an impact on knock-on work, but we will deal with that as we go along. What we don't do is hire in and hire out. Unfortunately, our industry takes a slightly different view in general, which is you work till you're finished, okay, no matter what those hours are, and you could be talking 12, 14, 15-hour days. We have seen, and I have experienced personally, hours where I've worked beyond the legal requirements of a heavy goods driver, for example, because we deliver in lorries. You're limited to 15 hours working day maximum in the heavy goods regulations. I have worked 18-hour days in our industry, waiting for keys, having to deliver. The surveyor's got his volume wrong. So in terms of contracts and all the things that you've said, Kate, about your industry, we'd love to offer that kind of flexibility. We can't. What we have to do is bring in a rigidity rather than a flexibility that protects our workers. So you can see the contrast between what Hannah's reported there and what is actually achievable in some sense. I think flexible contracts are great. I think 0-hour contracts, I disagree with you, Kate, are an absolute anathema to me. I think that people should know they're going to be earning something at some point and be sure that those hours are going to work. One of the great problems with 0-hour contracts is there's absolutely no certainty there at all. And people need to know that they're going to be earning some kind of money, they're going to have some income. I accept there are exceptions to that. Students in full-time education, retirees who are looking for just something, a little bit of extra pocket money, and obviously you're right about carers as well, older folk who are looking after older folk, or even parents who have childcare issues. I think that kind of flexibility needs to be taken into account.
It's also those who can't commit to their employer for a guaranteed number of hours.
You'll often find that's people with more than one job, and that's similar to our industry. So we do have a lot of workers within our industry who work on multiple of jobs. Yeah. And of course, if you don't know what you're going to be working the following week, how can you book with each employer? So you're going to have to, and the other exception, by the way, is those who have main jobs and are working in a secondary job, and that can be quite possible in your industry and ours as well. But yeah, so in terms of delivering that kind of certainty within contracts is difficult, especially within our industry, because we're not in control of what there is. But there is a lot of information in there that says, and the key finding of your report, which you may or may not recognise, is employer-employee engagement. Okay, speak to the people that matter, your employees. The first thing we did on our pathway to becoming what we are, which is a leading light in our industry for employee rights, was we asked our employees what they wanted. And that's a simple solution to any problem. And I think that ought to be something that can be driven by legislation, in that, you know, an employee voice is crucial within any organisation, because they are the people that really matter. And I think that doesn't get lost in your report, Anna. I think you cite that as a really key fundamental of driving through good practice.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm going to come back to you. I want to get inside some of the trade-offs that your business has to sort of make in order to offer the sort of security that you do in terms of income, because lots more people don't do that, and I want to unpack that a bit, so I'm marking your card. But the way we're going to do this, I think, we've got half an hour or so. I think we should chunk this up into two parts. Let's have a bit of a discussion about Hannah's data and basically what it's telling us about what's going on out there in terms of the use of different types of contracts of this sort. So let's try and clarify a few issues there, and then, of course, let's turn to a policy discussion about different things that are being proposed and how they might help or might not help, depending on your perspective. So that's how I think we should do it. The first thing I want to do, because it's always important in life to know, is the thing that you're talking about getting bigger or smaller over time? Because what Hannah has presented is basically a snapshot. It is a snapshot. So I think it is important just to get a sense of trajectory. And that sounds like a really simple question, but it's actually not that simple, because nothing in terms of measurement in the labour market is that simple. Is what we've learned after many years at this place. So Hannah, give us your sense in terms of what the data is telling us, about what's going on in terms of the prevalence of use of different types of highly flexible and some of them very precarious contracts, and then we'll sort of see how that resonates with others.
Yes, so as you say, it's not a simple question to answer. A lot of the issue, I mean, leaving aside kind of current issues with labour market data, a lot depends on how you define these contracts. So, you know, you can read different reports from different organisations or the same organisation that find different things depending on how you're measuring kind of what some people might call insecure, atypical, precarious, whatever contracts. But thinking about just kind of the different types of contracts that we focus on today, it looks like for the patterns are quite different for temporary contracts versus variable hours contracts. So for temporary contracts, it seems that when the economy weakens, when unemployment rises, the share of the workforce on temporary contracts tends to go up as you know employers are kind of needing to manage more uncertainty, and then they tend to come down as the economy and the labour market strengthens. For variable hours contracts, it's a bit kind of less cyclical. So 0 hours contracts is its own kind of complicated measurement issues over time, but in the kind of recent data where we've got a more reliable time series, it looks like there hasn't been very much kind of change over time. Even, you know, when unemployment has kind of become very low, it doesn't seem that that's meaning employers are having to put their staff onto different contracts. It seems like 0 hours contracts are still just as prevalent as they were a few years ago. And then for variable hours contracts, they seem to be declining slightly over time as both the share of workers on variable hours goes down, but also fewer workers are paid by the hour, so less kind of risk over their pay overall. Overall, when we kind of combine the different measures that we look at, we think they're possibly declining slightly, but kind of not huge amounts of change there. And then from the firm side, it's a bit more complicated. Again, kind of data issues there. So employers who we surveyed were more likely to say that they'd increase their use of these contracts than to have decreased them, but we only surveyed firms in detail that were using these contracts earlier this month. So we're kind of missing part of the picture, which is employers who aren't using these contracts at all. So it's not a straightforward answer, I'm afraid.
No, but the big picture, I mean, I think stepping right back for people who aren't sort of don't live in this space is, I mean, it's quite a lot of people we're talking about, although sometimes from news reports you think it's half the labour market, and obviously it's not. You're talking about kind of more than 1 in 10 of the workers. Obviously there will be different debates about definitions, but roughly speaking, a bit under 4 million people. The trend is not going through the roof. It is broadly steady, and some aspects of it are possibly declining. That's our best summary? Okay, I think that's really important, but it's still quite a lot of people. Just briefly on that, does that resonate? I mean, does that sound right to you? Does that sound wrong?
Yes.
What's your experience? I mean, you're overseeing a sector which is quite at the higher youth end.
Yes, which is inevitable if you think about the nature of hospitality and, you know, hotels, events. Day-to-day operations. High street is much more predictable, but even they have peaks and flows. Yes, it does resonate. I think one of the things that we can't get away from, though, is that those sectors of the economy that are more likely to use flexible or variable contracts will have been the most impacted by COVID, and that the recovery post-COVID has led to uncertainty about and unpredictability of demand, whether that's in removals and house buying and selling. You know, that has come through. We've had an unpredictable flow and ebb of tourists and international visitors, so any of the businesses around here would have been gearing up for something that didn't happen, and you have to have that. So yes, I think you've had a temporary increase in some of that kind of nature of employment because of the restart of the economy that we've had. But if you look at it over that 20-year period, I think you're seeing a move away, even in my sector, and as I said in the introduction, moving away from that temporary, short-term, casual, cash-in-hand approach to needing to fill labour towards a more stable, certain employment. It might not be certain on hours, and I take the point about income, but that's often what employees trade against, that they want to be able to do that. But we are moving towards less insecurity, more flexibility, and workers are driving that request for flexible hours.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna ask Kate and then Chris a question sort of more particular to your sector in a way. Okay, let me try out a line of sort of argument I hear on you, which is from people who are kind of understand that obviously sectors different, the nature of demand in sectors varies, and that it has impacts on how you think about your employment relationships. So people who kind of get that. But there is a sort of, and you can sort of find glimpses, bits of this in the data that Hannah presented. There's one view which is some sectors just have a kind of prevailing business model, which becomes the kind of way of doing things. And new entrants tend to copy, and employment agencies tend to establish ways of doing things in that sector. And in really high use sectors, that is a very high use of really short hours contracts, which people then are asked to flex up. And there'll probably always be some need for that in some of those sectors for demand reasons, but there's kind of like almost just like this is how we do things here, which leads to possibly more of it than you. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying I hear this a lot. Possibly more of it than you might expect. And my example is from retail, which I know is not your neighbourhood, but it's kind of it's obviously a big sector. It's a high use sector. And I had a very long exchange with one of the senior people in the retail. I won't say who they are because it was private, but they run a retail outfit. They are unusual because they had run a retail outfit in other Northern European countries, different patterns of working. They then came and ran a UK company, and they basically brought their assumptions about how you could do things and how they'd seen things happen elsewhere. It's here. They were, and in the UK, this company basically used really, really very short notice contracts. Lots and lots of people, not so much on 0 hours, but on like 5 hours, regularly working 25, with very short notice of that. And lots of cancellations with very short notice. So that, and people will recognise that story. They then basically tried to change that. They met massive resistance, not from the board actually, but from kind of low to middle management, who just said, you can't do that. It just won't work. It's literally impossible for us to plan and so on. And they did change it. It was quite painful, and they've made loads of progress. And their basic story was they would never have had the confidence to do that if they hadn't spent 10 years in dealing with Scandinavia and Holland, basically, where because of union recognition in certain sectors, that just was, the way of doing things was just different. What does that? I'll relate that to one bit of data here, which is only 15%, and I think only 20% of high-use firms in Hannah's results said it was essential to their competitiveness to use this approach towards employment contracts, which I thought was pretty low, actually. So does that resonate at all? Do you think actually maybe there is a bit of that? There's a kind of collective mindset, this is just how we do things, but we could do it a bit less if we had to.
I don't think in my sector.
Okay.
I think there is in other parts. That's what you got me here for. I think there is in other parts of the economy. I think there is a sort of big perception about how you always do things.
Yeah.
You have to remember that the reason that I say not in our sector, there's a couple of factors. One is about 3/4 of our industry, in some sectors it's as high as 80%, are small and medium-sized businesses. And they are very innovative, they're entrepreneurial, and they're startups. And so there isn't this is the way we always do things, in the same way that you do have in some of the sectors of the economy, probably like retail, where you've got a few key large players that set terms and conditions because that's just the nature of it. So we don't have that. We're very innovative and dynamic, and casual dining on the high street was only invented 20 years ago. So we've got new business models that have come through that are very different. And the third reason is we had a massive COVID reset moment. We restarted having had our businesses and our teams put on furlough for about 2 years. We had to restart with a labour market that was much tighter when we came out, with 15 to 20% vacancy rates in the hospitality sector, impacting our ability to be able to deliver. We had to change the ways we were doing things in terms of terms and conditions and ways of working. But we had been working on that before to be able to make sure that we could address some of those challenges and problems. And, I think that we do try really hard to fit with what our workers want and need, because we need them to be on our side. It's not top down, it's bottom up. People set their hours and tell us what they can work, and we work around the rota. And sometimes we have to then come back and say, I'm really sorry, we can't give you as many hours as you want. Or sometimes we have to say, we need you to work this shift to cover that. But we give them the flexibility to be able to look at that. So I don't think we do. I think sometimes employees choose to have that variability, and have that mindset of that's the way it's worked. But just to give you a couple of examples, I chair the ACC in Liverpool, which is the venue, the conference venue, the music venue. You know, if you have things that tighten it up too much or don't have the way that you want to look at these contracts, how do you scale up for Eurovision, for these high-tech events? How do you scale up for Labour Party conference? We want to keep those people on a contract of employment throughout the year, even when they need to be able to just do peaks and troughs, and we've got to be able to manage what they want as well, to be able to give them that ability. So there isn't a set way of doing things in our sector.
Okay.
It's
That's
much
a good point on which I'm going to segue to Chris, because you, as you said very clearly, Chris, in your sector, demand is just inherently quite difficult, which is one of the reasons he wanted you here. It's not an easy case. It's a really tough case.
Yeah.
You have chosen to give basically people security on a salary, as I understand it, and it's kind of like an annual hours thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely right.
Just tell us, so lots of your competitors, I'm assuming, do not do that?
No, in fact, most of them don't. Most of them operate what we would consider a casual contract and 0-hour contract.
So what do you have to do differently in terms of management to make that work for you? And what are the kind of downsides to you of being in a world where everybody else doesn't do that? And what are some of the advantages to you of being different?
Well, when we started on this journey, we didn't really sort of think about our competitors. We thought about ourselves. So we sat down and spoke to our staff back in 2014-15, and we tried a number of different ideas on pay, terms, conditions, and it was driven entirely by them. We just followed their lead on this. And we came to a conclusion in 2015 that they wanted a good pay, and so we looked for a good pay, and we went to the living wage for that benchmark, and that became the minimum we would pay. And we also looked for a way of controlling their finances throughout the year. And the problem with a lot of industries, and I don't just mean removals industry, but there are major employers within our industry who don't even budget their year. So they don't anticipate an income, they don't anticipate outgoings, they don't anticipate wage rises, they don't anticipate anything. They just simply fly by the seat of the pants. We budgeted, so we planned, we set a 5-year plan in place, we set budgets in place, and we worked on the steering that we got from the staff. And we never thought this is going to be a challenge in comparison with our competitors. We just did it. The fact that it worked was incredibly successful. And just to give you an idea of why it worked, the statistic I'd trot out probably best of all was when we became living wage and minimum hours, and we paid our staff sick pay from day one. I was told it's inflationary, you won't be competitive, you'll go out of business, they'll take advantage of all the things that I was told at the time, and I was told by my peers this. Actually, what happened was the reverse. We became more competitive because our sickness went down from, I won't give you the actual stats, because if I give you the actual stats, you won't believe me, but we were 131 days sickness with a statutory sick note. Without a statutory sick note, in 2015. When we became living wage employer in 2016, that dropped to 23. So there was a saving on having to bring in casual labour, recruitment, agency labour, of around about £20,800. It cost us £10,000 to become a living wage employer. So there was a 10,000 positive on our bottom line. That's just one example. I could go on and on and on about several other examples that went there. So we then we realised we were thriving on that kind of mentality. So in terms of the contracts, they're steered by the employees and we match them. And in terms of dealing with things like, one of the issues is about social life, about work-life balance. We have an agreement with our employees. If they need some time off or if they need to finish early because of our unpredictable hours, they can book a time in the diary where they need to be finished, and we will adjust our workload to match their requirements.
Can I just on that? We've had a question online which kind of related to something that you've said a few times, Kate. I mean, you're sort of resting quite a lot on like, this is what our workers want.
Yes.
And that is one of your central. How do you know? Just how do you know? And I want Hannah to tell us what we think we know. Like, how do we know stuff? Because sometimes we get told people do want some very, very secure contracts, and we say that. But how much, the extent to which that's the case, like what's their best data on it? And that someone sort of said, what's the, basically what lies behind the assertion that this is employee choice? So, okay, what's your answer to how you really know?
It's surveys of members. I mean, this is
filled in by.
We survey our members, and they are telling us that they're surveying their employees and their workforce.
But this is employees.
And this is us recommending to employers as part of our hoteliers charter and our employee wellbeing charter that is broader across hospitality. How should you, the commitment that you give to your workforce about transparency of rotas, length of notice, and how you're doing it. And obviously, this has been a subject for discussion for quite a long period of time. It's been about a decade that it's been talked about for legislation. Yeah. And so as part of that, we've been telling businesses that they should survey and ask and offer people the choice to move. And we've been trying to get the information and the data so that we know how prevalent this is, so we can do. So it's exactly the same as the resolution.
This is employer survey.
This is employers surveying their workforce, and the big employers asking their workforce, here's the choice. Do you want to move from 0 hours to a guaranteed minimum hours contract?
Okay, that's helpful. Because one of the charts, let's not bring it up, but one of the charts that Hannah showed was just in terms of people having some agency over their hours, people who are on hourly pay. This wasn't hospitality specific. This was high use firms. It was pretty low, actually. I mean, it was. It was most people don't get to choose their hours, basically, who are hourly workers. That's right, Hannah, isn't it? According to the firms who responded.
That's according to the workers.
That was according to the workers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we've got kind of in previous reports we've done, we've looked at data again, asking workers about things like anxiety about shifts getting cancelled, whether you get compensation when shifts are cancelled at the last minute. So there's definitely signs that these can be concerning, but I think it's often more interesting to think about some of the qualitative evidence that we've gathered in previous reports and kind of asking workers in focus groups. And I think there it's really clear that that it's not black and white. There are some workers where, they're on a 0 hours contract, so they're basically waiting for their employer to tell them what shifts they're getting, and that's really hard for them, and it's really insecure, and it's causing them problems with work-life balance and with their income. Equally, when those contracts are managed well, they can be really helpful. We've spoken to people who have health conditions or caring responsibilities where the flexibility can benefit them. But I think, Chris, it comes back to the point you made earlier about kind of those conversations between employers and employees. I think what has come out to me from the focus groups is whether it's good or bad for the worker really depends on how their employer is managing it.
Can I just comment? There are some key indicators as to telling you whether your employees want it or not. Sickness and absenteeism being one of them, and other indicators as well, such as staff retention. We've got 75% of our staff have been with us 5 years or more. So that kind of
tells you something.
I think there's also one key thing is that there isn't a one size fits all across the economy as a whole. In some of these cases, it will be, in some sectors it works, in some sectors it doesn't, in some employment practices work and some don't. Exploitation and abusive behaviour should be tackled, needs to be tackled. These kind of things aren't acceptable. People need certainty, but you also don't want to get away from choice.
That is a good point
flexibility
to take us forward towards policy, because time is rolling on. So we're going to bring up a poll, actually, if that's okay, to help us move us along. And I guess one question to sort of help us think about this is, what happens if nothing changes in terms of employment regulation? So where do we think the economy, preferences, living wage campaigns, worker voice, etc., where are we going to get to if nothing changes in terms of the policy landscape? And we have basically a kind of related question here, which is, if there's going to be a fall in the use of some of those sorts of contracts we've been discussing this morning over the kind of the medium term, if you like, what's going to be driving it? You can't say all of these things because that's just cheating. So I'll fill this in online. But basically, is it going to be consumers, a bit sceptical, but who decide to kind of through their consumption to sort of vote with their wallet, if you like? Is it going to be workers actually just sort of really talking about this lot, and obviously worker organisations like unions succeeding in pushing this? Is it going to be just a business kind of market kind of reaction to, in terms of recruitment and retention, which is a bit like what Chris has been saying? Is it going to be a campaign like we saw with the living wage campaign, which has put big pressure on sort of increasing the wage floor, doing the same for hours? Or is it just going to be because government comes along and changes the law and says you have to do it differently? So give us your thought on that. We'll come back to the answer in a few minutes. In terms of the policy discussion, and there's a few different bits of it I want to mark, but one central bit is I feel like the 0-hour contract issue sucks up a lot of the kind of energy and attention in this space. And that isn't to belittle it, and I mean, there are people on 0 contracts who really don't want to be, who are not getting the hours they want, and I think that is a problem, but it is also more complicated. But it feels just in terms of Hannah's numbers, that is significant, but it is a minority of the larger issue of people on short hours, very short hour contracts, regularly working many more hours, which may or may not be a problem depending on circumstances. But that is a bigger issue. The 0-hour contract doesn't speak to all that. That just speaks to one particular manifestation.
Yes. And actually, if you tackle 0 hours contracts, you might just result in more of that and not solving the problem.
You might have lots of 1-hour contracts. So there's kind of the reason I raise that is because I think are we living through a slightly faux debate in a way, whereby there's some people shouting you need to ban this one bad thing, and other people saying that would be a disaster in various ways if you did. Meanwhile, there's quite a few people are thinking it is important. Not everyone thinks this. This is not a consensus view, but there are quite a few people who think it is important that workers should have a right, not a right to request, a legal right to a contract reflecting their regular hours of work, which we can debate what that means. And that does not currently exist, and workers do not have that right at the moment, and they should. And actually, quite a few people think that's a sensible approach. The Low Pay Commission proposed it, God knows how many years ago. We've been arguing it for a decade. Lots of, whether we're sensible is for you to judge, but lots of people have been talking about this, and that might kind of emerge as sort of what people mean and what might actually happen. And that's kind of more interesting than the sort of bun fight about 0-hour contracts. What do you think of that interpretation? Kate, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the debate we need to be having, because if we're not careful, we will fall into a situation where you've got a headline and actually you just increase insecurity and precariousness, because you will reverse decades of progressive employment practices in sectors like mine, where we've moved people onto permanent contracts. But that gives them rights, that gives them protections. We can argue about the way in which the contract is applied and whether it works for them, doesn't work for them, and how we do it. But we don't want to reverse that, because if you're too dogmatic and black and white about it, that is inevitably what will happen in those circumstances. So I think you referenced the Low Pay Commission. It's one of the proudest things that I worked on in my career is ahead of that legislation coming through, working with the Labour Party in opposition as an employer representative to make sure we got that right. And that was about a tripartite dialogue between workers, representatives in unions, employers and the Labour Party to work through the detail of the legislation to secure the objective, but get it working in a way that didn't undermine employment practices and jobs. And that's what we're talking about here, is making sure we've got jobs for people that are good. So it's getting the detail right.
And on a right to a contract reflecting regular hours, somehow defined.
Yes.
In principle, that's your organisation is okay with that?
In principle, yes. We need to get the detail right.
Yeah, sure.
You need to make sure that if that doesn't come out in the right way and workers want to step back from it, they have a choice and a right to do that. And we need to get the reference period right to make sure that we've got it.
This is the period of time over which you measure what regular hours is.
Yes.
And there's going to be a debate about whether that's 12 weeks or a year or whatever.
Those are key.
Yeah.
And then there will be some categories of work which will be so unpredictable that doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that we don't take away the ability to keep those workers on a contract.
Yeah.
Because going back to 2-week contracts and taking somebody on for Wimbledon or for Christmas isn't where we want our industry to be. We want to be investing in them as individuals.
I think
don't
this
want
is
to be
interesting.
using agency workers.
So I think already, that is
much more nuanced.
That is much more nuanced, but that's quite a big, that right doesn't exist today. That right's never existed in my lifetime. And I think there's actually far more people who are interested in shaping that right.
Yes.
Then possibly the headlines would let
And I
you
think inevitably you will, from an employer's point of view, a right to request feels inherently more
Of course it does,
flexible, but we
yeah.
can work through, and with the right structure in place, as we did with the Low Pay Commission, getting it right, we can make sure we do get it right going forward so we don't jeopardise jobs.
Okay, thank you. How does that sound to you, Chris?
Well, there's three facets that need to be contemplated here. One of them is a significant Labour Party policy shift, which is enforcement of law.
Yep.
Because I'm a member of the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, and actually it sounds very grandiose, but actually we just enforce legislation within our company. We perhaps go a little bit beyond with the sick pay from day one, but fundamentally enforcement's key to this. You know, and actually. And there might be a sharp intake of breath around the room, but I think union activity needs to be greater. I think there needs to be more collaboration with the unions in terms of enforcing law. And I think that's something that is often ignored. We're almost still stuck in the 70s mentality about unions, and that needs to change. And we need to find somebody who can police and ensure that the right contracts are in place for the right people in the right place. And I share Kate's concerns about zero-hour contracts. I do think they should be an opt-in, not a default position, though. And I think in current legislation, I think 0 hours are a default position. You can have a 0-hour contract. There's no law to stop you doing that. And I think there needs to be a law to stop you doing it, but with a safety net of the ability to opt into 0-hour contracts.
But it needs to be meaningful, otherwise you just replace 0 hours with 2-hour contracts, and that doesn't take us any further forward.
Absolutely.
Can I just make one final very quick point about it, is that the other point, if we're looking at this and changing legislation, is time to implement. You need time and notice periods, because you are dealing with people's jobs and livelihoods, and what you don't want is to have something that is rushed with no implementation period, so you can't do good employment practice and negotiate with people, moving them on, changing their contracts and hours. So we need to have that right as well, and that's what we got right with the Low Pay Commission too.
No, I agree with that. Hannah, so we've just got now a right to a contract reflecting regular hours. Just say that's there. Given some of the other issues that your work has unearthed and just other things we know, what else should we be talking about? Because that obviously, that helps with some issues. It doesn't help you if you, think you're going to work an extra shift and then you get cancelled as you turn up. That doesn't speak to that issue. What are the other issues we might need to speak to, which we think there is actually a problem of potential exploitation or abuse of power?
Yes, I think alongside right to a predictable hours contract, I think tackling the issues that we're basically concerned about that can arise with flexible contracts, you need some kind of some kind of way of knowing what you're going to be working, and a safety net that if that has to change at the last minute, that you're not going to be out of pocket as a worker. So, 2 weeks notice of shifts, having compensation when the shifts are cancelled at the last minute. And then I think it's important to remember, all the things we're talking about today need to sit in a kind of broader suite of kind of labour market policy. So, we've not talked that much about the minimum wage today, but that's kind of an important part of making sure that jobs are good. Enforcement is a really important thing. We've talked a lot about the foundation making sure that these rights are actually, the workers are actually getting them because they're properly enforced, and possibly some kind of initiatives in sectors where there are particular issues that are very sector specific. We've recommended in social care bringing together workers, employers to agree standards there. So I think it's definitely it needs to be part of a wider suite of policy issues to make sure that workers' living standards are protected, and that's in the best way, that that it's not going to result in job losses as well.
Okay, thank you. If people in the room have any, I've taken a few questions from online. I'll try and take some more in the last few minutes. But is anyone itching to ask a question in the room? Because this is your opportunity to do so. If so, yeah. So we've got this lady in the second row, and then we've got the lady towards the back. If you can tell us who you are.
Hi, my name's Judy Stevenson. I'm an economic historian, and I look at contracts in the very, very long run.
Right.
And I really enjoyed the perspectives from the two employers. I want to advance the idea that they have both taken positioning decisions. I mean, what Kate's talking about is that different employers have different positions, but Anchor have it's a thought-leading, sector-leading position, but it's probably only possible because others have a much higher proportion of casual workers and casual contracts and are less thoughtful and thought-leading than you, because in any sector where you have extreme volatility of demand, you cannot have steady firms with steady employment contracts. It's simply not mathematically, arithmetically possible. So unless we understand that there are competition, not for costs, but for positioning and types of relationships that firms will have, we're not really going to understand the drivers of this. So thank you very much. Really enjoyed listening to you.
We'll come back to that, Chris, in a minute. Just let's take the question over there, and then I've got a question for Kate from online.
Hello, it's Delphine Strauss from the Financial Times.
Hello.
It was a question for Kate, just slightly broadening out. One of the changes we've seen over the last few years, alongside this sort of widespread use of flexible contracts, is a sort of steady drop in the average length of working hours. And I'd just be interested to know how far you see that sort of bedding in your sector, and what you think lies behind it. And then possibly a question for both of you, just lots of talk about sickness absence. To what extent is that an issue in your workforce at the moment? And again, what changes are you seeing, and how are employers thinking about it?
Okay.
Thank you. There's a gentleman with his hand up in the back row, and he's going to ask a very short question.
And I'm going to forget.
He's told me.
I'm going to forget all
Okay.
of those if I'm not.
Good morning. I'm Mike Salem from the Consumer Choice Centre. Maybe a sensible compromise here is perhaps allow employees to pick their hours, or have flexible contract hours, but then on the other hand have stronger, rigid worker rights in terms of breaks, vacation, etc. So where do you see that sort of compromise between the opposing sides of the argument on the panel?
Okay, thank you. So you don't have to answer all. In fact, please don't answer all of those. we need to wrap up in a minute. Will you speak to the question from the lady there?
Yeah, I would actually. One of the things that you say, you're quite right in saying that in theory you can't afford it, but I've proven you can. But can I also add that there's a wider debate to be had about procurement strategies of major anchor organisations. We're very successful at acquiring contracts because of the way we behave. And I think that if you roll that out in the wider procurement sector, then you will find that that's more achievable. And in terms of sickness and absenteeism, we've demonstrated factually that the better the pay you pay, the better the conditions your workers have, the lower your absenteeism. And that increases productivity, which is something that this country is in desperate need of.
Amen to that. I'm going to just add a twist to the question from my friend from the FT, which was about kind of shorter hours.
Yes.
Something which never gets talked about in this part of the hours debate, but I think needs to much more, particularly if you're an employer, which is universal credit.
I was going to use that very example.
And universal credit, basically, so we used to have a system where to get tax credits, you have to work 16 hours a week. Universal credit got rid of that, so people can work really short hours. You could argue, and I think many people do argue, that helped and was a useful context if you were a business relying on people working short hours who might flex up, because it meant that tax credits were available, universal credit was available in the way that didn't used to be the case. We now have something called in-work conditionality, which is basically what the sort of approach we traditionally associate with people who are out of work, trying to make them take jobs, for people who are in work, working short hours. So basically individuals on universal credit are facing heat if they are not earning enough money, and they need to be earning 18 hours at the national living wage in order for them not to face that heat. Lots of those people will be in your sector. And some of those people are going to be getting basically shouted at saying you need to get another job or you need to work more hours, which may well make those people less available for their current hospitality or retail employer who liked having them quite available. Is that something is that a discussion that you're having, or
we are having that discussion.
Yep.
I'm not sure I would frame it in quite that way,
there you
because
go.
I think the starting point for our employers is we would like our workforce to be working more hours. It is not us pushing down and stopping them working more hours. The general message coming back from employers, because we survey them and through the surveys that they're doing with their workers, is they would like workers committing more hours
Higher
to
hours
them. They would
anyway.
they would like people to be coming back. They want to be. The starting point is not default is 0 hours. The starting point is we want to have a longer term contract and we want to have higher hours with you. What can you commit? And workers not committing, and definitely we see workers asking for shorter hours now. Some of that will be to do with students, and some of that is to do with universal credit. Despite the fact that the 16 hours rule has gone, there is still a taper that's based on earnings.
Yes.
And there is still a disincentive that we find employees artificially restricting their hours, not because the employer is not offering them, but because they are choosing to work fewer hours because they don't want to hit that headroom and that taper. And so there is definitely an interrelationship between national living wage, universal credit and employment rights that needs to be considered in the round. And you can't look at this just in a silo, and there's a danger that the government and civil servants who do work on these policies do work it in the silo and they just look at that. And so we do need to look at it. The big thing that we've seen post-COVID, and it is more to do with COVID than it is to do with Brexit, although it's going to sound as though it's a Brexit issue. Pre-COVID, pre-Brexit, the non-UK part of our workforce tended to work higher hours.
Yeah.
They tended to commit and do 40 hours. And we now see the average hours are around 16 to 20. So that is one thing that we're grappling with. But also, you are seeing post-COVID workers wanting flexibility, and that is multiple jobs, their choice, and that is flexible hours, their choice, and variability. And for some people who want to work variable hours, we are a route through to be able to provide that. So it's a very nuanced debate, but we are seeing it. The answer to the question on sickness, we are exactly the same as you. We are not seeing an increase in sickness absence. We are giving that commitment to worker rights, and we have to have that flexibility. Obviously, that changes, and you do have to keep that flexibility inherent in that, because people will go sick. People will have last-minute bereavements and things that mean they cancel their shifts. We can give notice of shifts, but sometimes we have to have a flexibility to be able to do that. And then finally, the patterns of work. You're right, there are two business models that you've got. Either you've got the ability to have permanent part-time contracts with variable hours, or you don't have very many of your staff on that, and you use agency and temporary workers. We have to understand that there are trade-offs in the labour market and the economy. Some of that will be cut across if we have too prescriptive a set of legislation. You will force people down routes that you might not necessarily want to go, and you might push people out of the labour market, and at the moment we don't want to do that.
Can I just make
Last
a very
word,
quick
yep.
point on universal credit, because it's really important. The current universal credit policy is fundamentally wrong, which is work first, not best job. And if you're not offering good employment, why would you ever want to go into a company that's offering you 0-hour contracts and appalling terms of work? The work first policy needs to change to right job, right person in work progression, and the rest will fall into place.
Well, that's an interesting and upbeat note in many ways to finish on. We're going to bring up the answers to the poll. We can't give you a poll and not tell you what you said. And I am not shocked by the result that most of you think that the biggest reason this would change is because government will come along possibly quite soon and change the law. Although I would say these things are kind of iterative. I mean, like the living wage, the national living wage has gone up loads. For many reasons, but one of the reasons is because there was a very successful campaign talking about the need to raise the living wage, so these things do interact.
And the threat of legislation means good employers
Start
change
to
their practices and
yeah. So these are not binary, but that result doesn't massively surprise me. Okay, I said we finish at 10:30ish. It's 10:40ish. But so I think we should release you to your days. I hope you'll join me in thanking our three speakers. Thanks to all of you at home, in the office, and in the room. Hannah is going to be producing another excellent report on this issue, but from more of a worker perspective over the forthcoming months. So please come back and join us for that. And this debate is going to run. But I think it's going to be a slightly better informed debate as a result of some of what we've heard this morning. So thank you.